Chapter 27 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 27. The Story. "First, sir," said Caderousse, "you must make me a promise." "What is that?" inquired the abbé. "Why, if you ever make use of the details I am about to give you, that you will never let anyone know that it was I who supplied them. For the persons of whom I am about to talk are rich and powerful, and if they only laid the tips of their fingers on me, I should break to pieces like glass." "Make yourself easy, my friend," replied the abbé. "I am a priest, and confessions die in my breast. Recollect, our only desire is to carry out in a fitting manner the last wishes of our friend. Speak, then, without reserve, as without hatred. Tell the truth, the whole truth. I do not know, never may know, the persons of whom you are about to speak. Besides, I am an Italian, and not a Frenchman, and belong to God, and not to man. And I shall shortly retire to my convent, which I have only quitted to fulfill the last wishes of a dying man." This positive assurance seemed to give Caderousse a little courage. "Well, then, under these circumstances," said Caderousse, I even believe I ought to undeceive you as to the friendship which poor Edmond thought so sincere and unquestionable." "Begin with his father, if you please," said the abbé. "Edmond talked to me a great deal about the old man, for whom he had the deepest love." "The history is a sad one, sir," said Caderousse, shaking his head. "Perhaps you know all the earlier part of it?" "Yes," answered the abbé. "Edmond related to me everything until the moment when he was arrested in a small cabaret close to Marseilles." "At La Réserve? Oh, yes. I can see it all before me this moment." "Was it not his betrothal feast?" "It was. And the feast that began so gaily had a very sorrowful ending. A police commissary, followed by 4 soldiers, entered, and Dantès was arrested." "Yes, and up to this point I know all," said the priest. "Dantès himself only knew that which personally concerned him, for he never beheld again the 5 persons I have named to you, or heard mention of any one of them. Well, when Dantès was arrested, M. Morrel hastened to obtain the particulars, and they were very sad. The old man returned alone to his home, folded up his wedding suit with tears in his eyes, and paced up and down his chamber the whole day, and would not go to bed at all, for I was underneath him and heard him walking the whole night. And for myself, I assure you I could not sleep either, for the grief of the poor father gave me great uneasiness, and every step he took went to my heart, as really as if his foot had pressed against my breast." The next day Mercédès came to implore the protection of M. de Villefort. She did not obtain it, however, and went to visit the old man. When she saw him so miserable and heartbroken, having passed a sleepless night, and not touched food since the previous day, she wished him to go with her that she might take care of him, but the old man would not consent. "No," was the old man's reply, "I will not leave this house, for my poor dear boy loves me better than anything in the world, and if he gets out of prison he will come and see me the first thing, and what would he think if I did not wait here for him?" I heard all this from the window, for I was anxious that Mercédès should persuade the old man to accompany her, for his footsteps over my head night and day did not leave me a moment's repose. "But did you not go upstairs and try to console the poor old man?" asked the abbé. "Ah, sir," replied Caderousse, "we cannot console those who will not be consoled, and he was one of these. Besides, I know not why, but he seemed to dislike seeing me. One night, however, I heard his sobs, and I could not resist my desire to go up to him, but when I reached his door he was no longer weeping, but praying. I cannot now repeat to you, sir, all the eloquent words and imploring language he made use of. It was more than piety, it was more than grief, and I, who am no cantor, and hate the Jesuits, said then to myself, 'It is really well, and I am very glad that I have not any children, for if I were a father and felt such excessive grief as the old man does, and did not find in my memory or heart all he is now saying, I should throw myself into the sea at once, for I could not bear it.'" "Poor father," murmured the priest. From day to day he lived on alone, and more solitary. M. Morrel and Mercédès came to see him, but his door was closed, and although I was certain he was at home, he would not make any answer. One day, when contrary to his custom he had admitted Mercédès, and the poor girl, in spite of her own grief and despair, endeavored to console him, he said to her, "Be assured, my dear daughter, he is dead, and instead of expecting him, it is he who is awaiting us. I am quite happy, for I am the oldest, and of course shall see him first. However well disposed a person may be, why, you see, we leave off after a time seeing persons who are in sorrow. They make one melancholy. And so at last old Dantès was left all to himself, and I only saw from time to time strangers go up to him, and come down again with some bundle they tried to hide. But I guessed what these bundles were, and that he sold by degrees what he had to pay for his subsistence. At length the poor old fellow reached the end of all he had. He owed 3 quarters rent, and they threatened to turn him out. He begged for another week, which was granted to him. I know this because the landlord came into my apartment when he left his. For the first 3 days I heard him walking about as usual, but on the 4th I heard nothing. I then resolved to go up to him at all risks. The door was closed, but I looked through the keyhole and saw him so pale and haggard that, believing him very ill, I went and told M. Morrel, and then ran on to Mercédès. They both came immediately, M. Morrel bringing a doctor, and the doctor said it was inflammation of the bowels, and ordered him a limited diet. I was there too, and I never shall forget the old man's smile at this prescription. From that time he received all who came. He had an excuse for not eating any more. The doctor had put him on a diet. The abbé uttered a kind of groan. "The story interests you, does it not, sir?" inquired Caderousse. "Yes," replied the abbé, "it is very affecting." Mercédès came again, and she found him so altered that she was even more anxious than before to have him taken to her own home. This was M. Morrel's wish also, who would fain have conveyed the old man against his consent. But the old man resisted and cried, so that they were actually frightened. Mercédès remained, therefore, by his bedside, and M. Morrel went away, making a sign to the Catalan that he had left his purse on the chimney-piece. But availing himself of the doctor's order, the old man would not take any sustenance. At length, after 9 days of despair and fasting, the old man died, cursing those who had caused his misery, and saying to Mercédès, "If you ever see my Edmond again, tell him I die blessing him." The abbé rose from his chair, made 2 turns round the chamber, and pressed his trembling hand against his parched throat. "And you believe he died—" "Of hunger, sir, of hunger," said Caderousse. "I am as certain of it as that we too are Christians." The abbé, with a shaking hand, seized a glass of water that was standing by him half full, swallowed it at one gulp, and then resumed his seat, with red eyes and pale cheeks. "This was indeed a horrid event," said he in a hoarse voice. "The more so, sir, as it was men's and not God's doing." "Tell me of those men," said the abbé, "and remember too," he added in an almost menacing tone, "you have promised to tell me everything." "Tell me, therefore, who are these men who killed the son with despair and the father with famine?" "2 men jealous of him, sir, one from love and the other from ambition, Fernand and Danglars." "How was this jealousy manifested? Speak on." "They denounced Edmond as a Bonapartist agent." "Which of the 2 denounced him? Which was the real delinquent?" "Both, sir, one with a letter, and the other put it in the post." "And where was this letter written?" "At La Réserve, the day before the betrothal feast." "'Twas so, then," murmured the abbé. "Oh, Faria, Faria, how well did you judge men and things!" "What did you please to say, sir?" asked Caderousse. "Nothing, nothing," replied the priest. "Go on." "It was Danglars who wrote the denunciation with his left hand, that his writing might not be recognized, and Fernand who put it in the post." "But," exclaimed the abbé suddenly, "you were there yourself." "I?" said Caderousse, astonished. "Who told you I was there?" The abbé saw he had overshot the mark, and he added quickly, "No one, but in order to have known everything so well, you must have been an eyewitness." "True, true," said Caderousse in a choking voice, "I was there." "And did you not remonstrate against such infamy?" asked the abbé. "If not, you were an accomplice." "Sir," replied Caderousse, "they had made me drink to such an excess that I nearly lost all perception. I had only an indistinct understanding of what was passing around me. I said all that a man in such a state could say, but they both assured me that it was a jest they were carrying on, and perfectly harmless." Next day, sir, you must have seen plain enough what they had been doing, yet you said nothing, though you were present when Dantès was arrested." "Yes, sir, I was there, and very anxious to speak, but Danglars restrained me. 'If he should really be guilty,' said he, 'and did really put into the island of Elba, if he is really charged with a letter for the Bonapartist committee at Paris, and if they find this letter upon him, those who have supported him will pass for his accomplices.' I confess I had my fears, in the state in which politics then were, and I held my tongue. It was cowardly, I confess, but it was not criminal." I understand. You allowed matters to take their course, that was all. Yes, sir, answered Caderousse, and remorse preys on me night and day. I often ask pardon of God, I swear to you, because this action, the only one with which I have seriously to reproach myself in all my life, is no doubt the cause of my abject condition. I am expiating a moment of selfishness, and so I always say to La Carconte when she complains, Hold your tongue, woman, it is the will of God. And Caderousse bowed his head with every sign of real repentance. Well, sir, said the abbé, you have spoken unreservedly, and thus to accuse yourself is to deserve pardon. Unfortunately, Edmond is dead, and has not pardoned me. He did not know, said the abbé. But he knows it all now, interrupted Caderousse. They say the dead know everything. There was a brief silence. The abbé rose and paced up and down pensively, and then resumed his seat. You have 2 or 3 times mentioned a Monsieur Morrel, he said. Who was he? The owner of the Pharaon and patron of Dantès. And what part did he play in this sad drama? Inquired the abbé. The part of an honest man, full of courage and real regard. 20 times he interceded for Edmond. When the emperor returned, he wrote, implored, threatened, and so energetically that on the second restoration he was persecuted as a Bonapartist. 10 times, as I told you, he came to see Dantès' father, and offered to receive him in his own house, and the night or 2 before his death, as I have already said, he left his purse on the mantelpiece, with which they paid the old man's debts and buried him decently, and so Edmond's father died as he had lived, without doing harm to anyone. I have the purse still by me, a large one, made of red silk. And, asked the abbé, is Monsieur Morrel still alive? Yes, replied Caderousse. In that case, replied the abbé, he should be rich, happy. Caderousse smiled bitterly. Yes, happy as myself, said he. What, Monsieur Morrel unhappy? Exclaimed the abbé. He is reduced almost to the last extremity. Nay, he is almost at the point of dishonour. How? Yes, continued Caderousse, so it is. After 25 years of labour, after having acquired a most honourable name in the trade of Marseille, Monsieur Morrel is utterly ruined. He has lost 5 ships in 2 years, has suffered by the bankruptcy of 3 large houses, and his only hope now is in that very Pharaon which poor Dantès commanded, and which is expected from the Indies with a cargo of cochineal and indigo. If this ship founders, like the others, he is a ruined man. And has the unfortunate man wife or children? Inquired the abbé. Yes, he has a wife, who through everything has behaved like an angel. He has a daughter who was about to marry the man she loved, but whose family now will not allow him to wed the daughter of a ruined man. He has besides a son, a lieutenant in the army, and, as you may suppose, all this, instead of lessening, only augments his sorrows. If he were alone in the world, he would blow out his brains, and there would be an end. Horrible! Ejaculated the priest. And it is thus heaven recompenses virtue, sir, added Caderousse. You see, I, who never did a bad action, but that I have told you of, am in destitution, with my poor wife dying of fever before my very eyes, and I unable to do anything in the world for her. I shall die of hunger, as old Dantès did, while Fernand and Danglars are rolling in wealth. How is that? Because their deeds have brought them good fortune, while honest men have been reduced to misery. What has become of Danglars, the instigator, and therefore the most guilty? What has become of him? Why, he left Marseille, and was taken, on the recommendation of Monsieur Morrel, who did not know his crime, as cashier into a Spanish bank. During the war with Spain, he was employed in the commissariat of the French army, and made a fortune. Then with that money he speculated in the funds, and trebled or quadrupled his capital. And having first married his banker's daughter, who left him a widower, he has married a second time, a widow, a Madame de Nargon, daughter of Monsieur de Servieux, the king's chamberlain, who is in high favour at court. He is a millionaire, and they have made him a baron, and now he is the Baron Danglars, with a fine residence in the Rue de Mont Blanc, with 10 horses in his stables, 6 footmen in his antechamber, and I know not how many millions in his strong-box. Ah, said the abbé in a peculiar tone, he is happy. Happy? Who can answer for that? Happiness or unhappiness is the secret known but to oneself and the walls. Walls have ears but no tongue. But if a large fortune produces happiness, Danglars is happy. And Fernand? Fernand, why, much the same story. But how could a poor Catalan fisher boy, without education or resources, make a fortune? I confess this staggers me. And it has staggered everybody. There must have been in his life some strange secret that no one knows. But then, by what visible steps has he attained this high fortune or high position? Both, sir, he has both fortune and position, both. This must be impossible. It would seem so, but listen, and you will understand. Some days before the return of the Emperor, Fernand was drafted. The Bourbons left him quietly enough at the Catalans, but Napoleon returned, a special levy was made, and Fernand was compelled to join. I went too, but as I was older than Fernand, and had just married my poor wife, I was only sent to the coast. Fernand was enrolled in the active troop, went to the frontier with his regiment, and was at the Battle of Ligny. The night after that battle, he was sentry at the door of a general, who carried on a secret correspondence with the enemy. That same night the general was to go over to the English. He proposed to Fernand to accompany him. Fernand agreed to do so, deserted his post, and followed the general. Fernand would have been court-martialed if Napoleon had remained on the throne. But his action was rewarded by the Bourbons. He returned to France with the epaulet of sub-lieutenant, and as the protection of the general, who is in the highest favour, was accorded to him, he was a captain in 1823 during the Spanish War. That is to say, at the time when Danglars made his early speculations. Fernand was a Spaniard, and being sent to Spain to ascertain the feeling of his fellow countrymen, found Danglars there, got on very intimate terms with him, won over the support of the royalists at the capital and in the provinces, received promises and made pledges on his own part, guided his regiment by paths known to himself alone through the mountain gorges which were held by the royalists, and in fact rendered such services in this brief campaign that, after the taking of Trocadero, he was made colonel, and received the title of count and the cross of an officer of the Legion of Honor. Destiny, destiny, murmured the abbé. Yes, but listen, this was not all. The war with Spain being ended, Fernand's career was checked by the long peace which seemed likely to endure throughout Europe. Greece only had risen against Turkey, and had begun her war of independence. All eyes were turned towards Athens. It was the fashion to pity and support the Greeks. The French government, without protecting them openly as you know, gave countenance to volunteer assistance. Fernand sought and obtained leave to go and serve in Greece, still having his name kept on the army roll. Some time after, it was stated that the Comte de Morcerf, this was the name he bore, had entered the service of Ali Pasha with the rank of Instructor General. Ali Pasha was killed, as you know, but before he died, he recompensed the services of Fernand by leaving him a considerable sum, with which he returned to France, when he was gazetted Lieutenant General. So that now? Inquired the abbé. So that now, continued Caderousse, he owns a magnificent house, number 27 Rue du Helder, Paris. The abbé opened his mouth, hesitated for a moment. Then, making an effort at self-control, he said, "And Mercédès, they tell me that she has disappeared." "Disappeared," said Caderousse. "Yes, as the sun disappears, to rise the next day with still more splendor." "Has she made a fortune also?" inquired the abbé with an ironical smile. "Mercédès is at this moment one of the greatest ladies in Paris," replied Caderousse. "Go on," said the abbé. "It seems as if I were listening to the story of a dream. But I have seen things so extraordinary that what you tell me seems less astonishing than it otherwise might." Mercédès was at first in the deepest despair at the blow which deprived her of Edmond. I have told you of her attempts to propitiate M. de Villefort, her devotion to the elder Dantès. In the midst of her despair, a new affliction overtook her. This was the departure of Fernand whose crime she did not know, and whom she regarded as her brother. Fernand went, and Mercédès remained alone. 3 months passed, and still she wept. No news of Edmond, no news of Fernand, no companionship save that of an old man who was dying with despair. One evening, after a day of accustomed vigil at the angle of 2 roads leading to Marseille from the Catalans, she returned to her home more depressed than ever. Suddenly she heard a step she knew, turned anxiously around, the door opened, and Fernand, dressed in the uniform of a sub-lieutenant, stood before her. It was not the one she wished for most, but it seemed as if a part of her past life had returned to her. Mercédès seized Fernand's hands, with a transport which he took for love, but which was only joy at being no longer alone in the world, and seeing at last a friend after long hours of solitary sorrow. And then, it must be confessed, Fernand had never been hated. He was only not precisely loved. Another possessed all Mercédès' heart. That other was absent, had disappeared, perhaps was dead. At this last thought, Mercédès burst into a flood of tears and wrung her hands in agony. But the thought, which she had always repelled before, when it was suggested to her by another, came now in full force upon her mind. And then, too, old Dantès incessantly said to her, "Our Edmond is dead. If he were not, he would return to us." The old man died, as I have told you. Had he lived, Mercédès perchance had not become the wife of another, for he would have been there to reproach her infidelity. Fernand saw this, and when he learned of the old man's death, he returned. He was now a lieutenant. At his first coming he had not said a word of love to Mercédès. At the second he reminded her that he loved her. Mercédès begged for 6 months more in which to await and mourn for Edmond. "So that," said the abbé with a bitter smile, "that makes 18 months in all. What more could the most devoted lover desire?" Then he murmured the words of the English poet, "Frailty, thy name is woman." 6 months afterwards, continued Caderousse, the marriage took place in the church of Accoules. "The very church in which she was to have married Edmond," murmured the priest. "There was only a change of bridegrooms." "Well, Mercédès was married," proceeded Caderousse. "But although in the eyes of the world she appeared calm, she nearly fainted as she passed La Réserve, where 18 months before the betrothal had been celebrated with him whom she might have known she still loved had she looked to the bottom of her heart. Fernand, more happy, but not more at his ease, for I saw at this time he was in constant dread of Edmond's return. Fernand was very anxious to get his wife away, and to depart himself. There were too many unpleasant possibilities associated with the Catalans, and 8 days after the wedding they left Marseille. "Did you ever see Mercédès again?" inquired the priest. "Yes, during the Spanish War, at Perpignan, where Fernand had left her. She was attending to the education of her son." The abbé started. "Her son?" said he. "Yes," replied Caderousse, "little Albert." "But then, to be able to instruct her child," continued the abbé, "she must have received an education herself. I understood from Edmond that she was the daughter of a simple fisherman, beautiful, but uneducated." "Oh," replied Caderousse, "did he know so little of his lovely betrothed? Mercédès might have been a queen, sir, if the crown were to be placed on the heads of the loveliest and most intelligent." "Fernand's fortune was already waxing great, and she developed with his growing fortune. She learned drawing, music, everything. Besides, I believe, between ourselves, she did this in order to distract her mind, that she might forget. And she only filled her head in order to alleviate the weight on her heart. But now her position in life is assured," continued Caderousse. "No doubt fortune and honors have comforted her. She is rich, a countess, and yet—" Caderousse paused. "And yet what?" asked the abbé. "Yet I am sure she is not happy," said Caderousse. "What makes you believe this?" "Why, when I found myself utterly destitute, I thought my old friends would perhaps assist me. So I went to Danglars, who would not even receive me. I called on Fernand, who sent me 100 francs by his valet de chambre." "Then you did not see either of them?" "No, but Madame de Morcerf saw me." "How was that?" "As I went away, a purse fell at my feet. It contained 25 louis. I raised my head quickly, and saw Mercédès, who at once shut the blind." "And Monsieur de Villefort?" asked the abbé. "Oh, he never was a friend of mine. I did not know him, and had nothing to ask of him." "Do you not know what became of him, and the share he had in Edmond's misfortunes?" "No, I only know that some time after Edmond's arrest, he married Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran, and soon after left Marseille. No doubt he has been as lucky as the rest. No doubt he is as rich as Danglars, as high in station as Fernand. I only, as you see, have remained poor, wretched, and forgotten." "You are mistaken, my friend," replied the abbé. "God may seem sometimes to forget for a time, while his justice reposes. But there always comes a moment when he remembers, and behold, a proof." As he spoke, the abbé took the diamond from his pocket, and giving it to Caderousse, said, "Here, my friend, take this diamond, it is yours." "What, for me only?" cried Caderousse. "Ah, sir, do not jest with me." "The diamond was to have been shared among his friends. Edmond had one friend only, and thus it cannot be divided. Take the diamond, then, and sell it. It is worth 50,000 francs. And I repeat my wish that this sum may suffice to release you from your wretchedness." "Oh, sir," said Caderousse, putting out one hand timidly, and with the other wiping away the perspiration which bedewed his brow. "Oh, sir, do not make a jest of the happiness or despair of a man. I know what happiness and what despair are, and I never make a jest of such feelings. Take it, then, but in exchange—" Caderousse, who touched the diamond, withdrew his hand. The abbé smiled. "In exchange," he continued, "give me the red silk purse that M. Morrel left on old Dantès' chimney-piece, and which you tell me is still in your hands." Caderousse, more and more astonished, went toward a large oaken cupboard, opened it, and gave the abbé a long purse of faded red silk, round which were 2 copper runners that had once been gilt. The abbé took it, and in return gave Caderousse the diamond. "Oh, you are a man of God, sir," cried Caderousse, "for no one knew that Edmond had given you this diamond, and you might have kept it." "Which," said the abbé to himself, "you would have done." The abbé rose, took his hat and gloves. "Well," he said, "all you have told me is perfectly true, then, and I may believe it in every particular." "See, sir," replied Caderousse, "in this corner is a crucifix in holy wood. Here on this shelf is my wife's testament. Open this book, and I will swear upon it with my hand on the crucifix. I will swear to you by my soul's salvation, my faith as a Christian. I have told everything to you as it occurred, and as the recording angel will tell it to the ear of God at the day of the last judgment." "'Tis well," said the abbé, convinced by his manner and tone that Caderousse spoke the truth. "'Tis well, and may this money profit you. Adieu, I go far from men who thus so bitterly injure each other." The abbé with difficulty got away from the enthusiastic thanks of Caderousse, opened the door himself, got out and mounted his horse, once more saluted the innkeeper, who kept uttering his loud farewells, and then returned by the road he had travelled in coming. When Caderousse turned around, he saw behind him La Carconte, paler and trembling more than ever. "Is, then, all that I have heard really true?" she inquired. "What, that he has given the diamond to us only?" inquired Caderousse, half bewildered with joy. "Yes, nothing more true. See, here it is." The woman gazed at it a moment, and then said in a gloomy voice, "Suppose it's false?" Caderousse started and turned pale. "False!" he muttered. "False! Why should that man give me a false diamond?" "To get your secret without paying for it, you blockhead." Caderousse remained for a moment aghast under the weight of such an idea. "Oh," he said, taking up his hat, which he placed on the red handkerchief tied round his head, "we will soon find out." "In what way?" "Why, the fair is on at Beaucaire. There are always jewellers from Paris there, and I will show it to them. Look after the housewife, and I shall be back in 2 hours." And Caderousse left the house in haste, and ran rapidly in the direction opposite to that which the priest had taken. 50,000 francs, muttered La Carconte when left alone. "It is a large sum of money, but it is not a fortune." End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of the Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 28. The Prison Register. The day after that in which the scene we have just described had taken place on the road between Bellegarde and Beaucaire, a man of about 30 or 32, dressed in a bright blue frock coat, nankeen trousers, and a white waistcoat, having the appearance and accent of an Englishman, presented himself before the mayor of Marseille. "Sir," said he, "I am chief clerk of the house of Thompson and French of Rome. We are, and have been these 10 years, connected with the house of Morel and Son of Marseille. We have 100,000 francs or thereabouts loaned on their securities, and we are a little uneasy at reports that have reached us that the firm is on the brink of ruin. I have come, therefore, express from Rome to ask you for information." "Sir," replied the mayor, "I know very well that during the last 4 or 5 years misfortune has seemed to pursue Monsieur Morel. He has lost 4 or 5 vessels, and suffered by 3 or 4 bankruptcies. But it is not for me, although I am a creditor myself to the amount of 10,000 francs, to give any information as to the state of his finances. Ask of me, as mayor, what is my opinion of Monsieur Morel, and I shall say that he is a man honorable to the last degree, and who has up to this time fulfilled every engagement with scrupulous punctuality. This is all I can say, sir. If you wish to learn more, address yourself to Monsieur de Beauville, the inspector of prisons, number 15, Rue de Noailles. He has, I believe, 200,000 francs in Morel's hands, and if there be any grounds for apprehension, as this is a greater amount than mine, you will most probably find him better informed than myself." The Englishman seemed to appreciate this extreme delicacy, made his bow, and went away, proceeding with a characteristic British stride towards the street mentioned. Monsieur de Beauville was in his private room, and the Englishman, on perceiving him, made a gesture of surprise, which seemed to indicate that it was not the first time he had been in his presence. As to Monsieur de Beauville, he was in such a state of despair that it was evident all the faculties of his mind, absorbed in the thought which occupied him at the moment, did not allow either his memory or his imagination to stray to the past. The Englishman, with the coolness of his nation, addressed him in terms nearly similar to those with which he had accosted the mayor of Marseille. "Oh, sir," exclaimed Monsieur de Boville, "your fears are unfortunately but too well founded, and you see before you a man in despair. I had 200,000 francs placed in the hands of Morel and Son. These 200,000 francs were the dowry of my daughter, who was to be married in a fortnight. And these 200,000 francs were payable, half on the 15th of this month, and the other half on the 15th of the next month. I had informed Monsieur Morel of my desire to have these payments punctually, and he has been here within the last half hour to tell me that if his ship, the Pharaon, did not come into port on the 15th, he would be wholly unable to make this payment." "But," said the Englishman, "this looks very much like a suspension of payment." "It looks more like bankruptcy," exclaimed Monsieur de Boville despairingly. The Englishman appeared to reflect a moment, and then said, "From which it would appear, sir, that this credit inspires you with considerable apprehension?" "To tell you the truth, I consider it lost." "Well, then, I will buy it of you." "You?" "Yes, I." "But at a tremendous discount, of course." "No, for 200,000 francs. Our house," added the Englishman with a laugh, "does not do things in that way." "And you will pay—" "Ready money." And the Englishman drew from his pocket a bundle of banknotes, which might have been twice the sum Monsieur de Boville feared to lose. A ray of joy passed across Monsieur de Boville's countenance, yet he made an effort at self-control, and said, "Sir, I ought to tell you that, in all probability, you will not realize 6% of this sum." "That's no affair of mine," replied the Englishman. "That is the affair of the house of Thomson and French, in whose name I act. They have, perhaps, some motive to serve in hastening the ruin of a rival firm. But all I know, sir, is that I am ready to hand you over this sum in exchange for your assignment of the debt. I only ask a brokerage." "Of course, that is perfectly just," cried Monsieur de Boville. "The commission is usually 1.5. Will you have 2, 3, 5%, or even more?" "Whatever you say." "Sir," replied the Englishman, laughing, "I am like my house, and do not do such things. No, the commission I ask is quite different." "Name it, sir, I beg." "You are the inspector of prisons?" "I have been so these 14 years." "You keep the registers of entries and departures?" "I do." "To these registers there are added notes relative to the prisoners?" "There are special reports on every prisoner." "Well, sir, I was educated at home by a poor devil of an abbé, who disappeared suddenly. I have since learned that he was confined in the Château d'If, and I should like to learn some particulars of his death." "What was his name?" "The Abbé Faria." "Oh, I recollect him perfectly," cried Monsieur de Boville. "He was crazy." "So they said." "Oh, he was decidedly." "Very possibly. But what sort of madness was it?" "He pretended to know of an immense treasure, and offered vast sums to the government if they would liberate him." "Poor devil! And he is dead?" "Yes, sir, 5 or 6 months ago, last February." "You have a good memory, sir, to recollect dates so well." "I recollect this, because the poor devil's death was accompanied by a singular incident." "May I ask what that was?" said the Englishman, with an expression of curiosity, which a close observer would have been astonished at discovering in his phlegmatic countenance. "Oh dear, yes, sir, the abbé's dungeon was 40 or 50 feet distant from that of one of Bonaparte's emissaries, one of those who had contributed the most to the return of the usurper in 1815. A very resolute and very dangerous man." "Indeed," said the Englishman. "Yes," replied Monsieur de Boville. "I myself had occasion to see this man in 1816 or 1817, and we could only go into his dungeon with a file of soldiers. That man made a deep impression on me. I shall never forget his countenance." The Englishman smiled imperceptibly. "And you say, sir," he interposed, "that the two dungeons were separated by a distance of 50 feet, but it appears that this Edmond Dantès—" "This dangerous man's name was—" "Edmond Dantès. It appears, sir, that this Edmond Dantès had procured tools or made them, for they found a tunnel through which the prisoners held communication with one another." "This tunnel was dug, no doubt, with an intention of escape?" "No doubt, but unfortunately for the prisoners, the Abbé Faria had an attack of catalepsy and died." "That must have cut short the projects of escape." "For the dead man, yes," replied Monsieur de Boville, "but not for the survivor. On the contrary, This Dantès saw a means of accelerating his escape. He no doubt thought that prisoners who died in the Château d'If were interred in an ordinary burial ground, and he conveyed the dead man into his own cell, took his place in the sack in which they had sewed up the corpse, and awaited the moment of interment. "It was a bold step, and one that showed some courage," remarked the Englishman. "As I have already told you, sir, he was a very dangerous man, and fortunately by his own act disembarrassed the government of the fears it had on his account." "How was that?" "How? Do you not comprehend? No. The Château d'If has no cemetery, and they simply throw the dead into the sea after fastening a 36-pound cannonball to their feet." "Well," observed the Englishman, as if he were slow of comprehension, "well, they fastened a 36-pound ball to his feet and threw him into the sea." "Really?" exclaimed the Englishman. "Yes, sir," continued the inspector of prisons. "You may imagine the amazement of the fugitive when he found himself flung headlong over the rocks. I should like to have seen his face at that moment." "That would have been difficult." "No matter," replied de Boville, in a supreme good humor at the certainty of recovering his 200,000 francs. "No matter, I can fancy it." And he shouted with laughter. "So can I," said the Englishman, and he laughed too, but he laughed as the English do, at the end of his teeth. "And so," continued the Englishman, who first gained his composure, "he was drowned?" "Unquestionably." "So that the governor got rid of the dangerous and the crazy prisoner at the same time?" "Precisely." "But some official document was drawn up as to this affair, I suppose?" inquired the Englishman. "Yes, yes, the mortuary deposition. You understand, Dantès' relations, if he had any, might have some interest in knowing if he were dead or alive. So that now, if there were anything to inherit from him, they may do so with easy conscience. He is dead, and make no mistake about it." "Oh, yes, and they may have the fact attested whenever they please." "So be it," said the Englishman. "But to return to these registers." "True, the story has diverted our attention from them. Excuse me." "Excuse you for what? For the story? By no means. It really seems to me very curious." "Yes, indeed. So, sir, you wish to see all relating to the poor abbé, who really was gentleness itself?" "Yes, you will oblige me." "Go into my study here, and I will show it to you." And they both entered Monsieur de Boville's study. Everything was here arranged in perfect order. Each register had its number, each file of papers its place. The inspector begged the Englishman to seat himself in an armchair, and place before him the register and the documents relative to the Château d'If, giving him all the time he desired for the examination, while de Boville seated himself in a corner, and began to read his newspaper. The Englishman easily found the entries relative to the Abbé Faria, but it seemed that the history which the inspector had related interested him greatly, for after having perused the first documents he turned over the leaves until he reached the deposition respecting Edmond Dantès. There he found everything arranged in due order: the accusation, examination, Morel's petition, M. de Villefort's marginal notes. He folded up the accusation quietly, and put it as quietly in his pocket, read the examination, and saw that the name of Noirtier was not mentioned in it, perused too the application dated 10th April 1815, in which Morel, by the deputy procuror's advice, exaggerated with the best intentions, for Napoleon was then on the throne, the services Dantès had rendered to the imperial cause, services which Villefort's certificates rendered indispensable. Then he saw through the whole thing. This petition to Napoleon, kept back by Villefort, had become, under the second restoration, a terrible weapon against him in the hands of the king's attorney. He was no longer astonished when he searched on to find in the register this note placed in a bracket against his name: Edmond Dantès, an inveterate Bonapartist, took an active part in the return from the island of Elba, to be kept in strict solitary confinement, and to be closely watched and guarded. Beneath these lines was written in another hand, "See note above, nothing can be done." He compared the writing in the bracket with the writing of the certificate placed beneath Morel's petition, and discovered that the note in the bracket was the same writing as the certificate, that is to say, was in Villefort's handwriting. As to the note which accompanied this, the Englishman understood that it might have been added by some inspector who had taken a momentary interest in Dantès' situation, but who had, from the remarks we have quoted, found it impossible to give any effect to the interest he had felt. As we have said, the inspector, from discretion, and that he might not disturb the Abbé Faria's pupil in his researches, had seated himself in a corner and was reading Le Drapeau Blanc. He did not see the Englishman fold up and place in his pocket the accusation written by Danglars under the arbor of La Réserve, and which had the postmark Marseille, 27th February, delivery 6 o'clock p.m. But it must be said that if he had seen it, he attached so little importance to this scrap of paper, and so much importance to his 200,000 francs, that he would not have opposed whatever the Englishman might do, however irregular it might be. "Thanks," said the latter, closing the register with a slam. "I have all I want. Now it is for me to perform my promise. Give me a simple assignment of your debt, acknowledge therein the receipt of the cash, and I will hand you over the money." He rose, gave his seat to M. de Beauville, who took it without ceremony, and quickly drew up the required assignment, while the Englishman counted out the banknotes on the other side of the desk. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 29. The House of Morel and Son. Anyone who had quitted Marseille a few years previously, well acquainted with the interior of Morel's warehouse, and had returned at this date, would have found a great change. Instead of that air of life, of comfort, and of happiness that permeates a flourishing and prosperous business establishment, instead of merry faces at the windows, busy clerks hurrying to and fro in the long corridors, instead of the court, filled with bales of goods, re-echoing with the cries and the jokes of porters, one would have immediately perceived all aspect of sadness and gloom. Out of all the numerous clerks that used to fill the deserted corridor and the empty office, but two remained. One was a young man of 3 or 4 and 20, who was in love with M. Morel's daughter, and had remained with him in spite of the efforts of his friends to induce him to withdraw. The other was an old, one-eyed cashier called Cocles, or Cockeye, a nickname given him by the young men who used to throng this vast, now almost deserted beehive, and which had so completely replaced his real name that he would not, in all probability, have replied to anyone who addressed him by it. Cocles remained in M. Morel's service, and a most singular change had taken place in his position. He had, at the same time, risen to the rank of cashier, and sunk to the rank of a servant. He was, however, the same Cocles, good, patient, devoted, but inflexible on the subject of arithmetic, the only point on which he would have stood firm against the world, even against M. Morel, and strong in the multiplication table, which he had at his fingers' ends, no matter what scheme or what trap was laid to catch him. In the midst of the disasters that befell the house, Cocles was the only one unmoved. But this did not arise from want of affection. On the contrary, from a firm conviction. Like the rats that one by one forsake the doomed ship, even before the vessel weighs anchor, so all the numerous clerks had, by degrees, deserted the office and the warehouse. Cocles had seen them go without thinking of inquiring the cause of their departure. Everything was, as we have said, a question of arithmetic to Cocles, and during 20 years he had always seen all payments made with such exactitude that it seemed as impossible to him that the house should stop payment as it would to a miller that the river that had so long turned his mill should cease to flow. Nothing had, as yet, occurred to shake Cocles' belief. The last month's payment had been made with the most scrupulous exactitude. Cocles had detected an overbalance of 14 sous in his cash, and the same evening he had brought them to M. Morel, who, with a melancholy smile, threw them into an almost empty drawer, saying, "Thanks, Cocles, you are the pearl of cashiers." Cocles went away perfectly happy, for this eulogium of M. Morel, himself the pearl of the honest men of Marseille, flattered him more than a present of 50 crowns. But since the end of the month, M. Morel had passed many an anxious hour. In order to meet the payments then due, he had collected all his resources, and, fearing lest the report of his distress should get bruited abroad at Marseille when he was known to be reduced to such an extremity, he went to the Beaucaire fair to sell his wife's and daughter's jewels, and a portion of his plate. By this means the end of the month was past, but his resources were now exhausted. Credit, owing to the reports afloat, was no longer to be had, and to meet the 100,000 francs due on the 15th of the present month, and the 100,000 francs due on the 15th of the next month to Monsieur de Beauville, Monsieur Morrel had, in reality, no hope but the return of the Pharaon, of whose departure he had learned from a vessel which had weighed anchor at the same time, and which had already arrived in harbor. But this vessel, which, like the Pharaon, came from Calcutta, had been in for a fortnight, while no intelligence had been received of the Pharaon. Such was the state of affairs when, the day after his interview with Monsieur de Beauville, the confidential clerk of the house of Thomson and French of Rome presented himself at Monsieur Morrel's. Emmanuel received him. This young man was alarmed by the appearance of every new face, for every new face might be that of a new creditor, come in anxiety to question the head of the house. The young man, wishing to spare his employer the pain of this interview, questioned the newcomer, but the stranger declared that he had nothing to say to Monsieur Emmanuel, and that his business was with Monsieur Morrel in person. Emmanuel sighed and summoned Cocles. Cocles appeared, and the young man bade him conduct the stranger to Monsieur Morrel's apartment. Cocles went first, and the stranger followed him. On the staircase they met a beautiful girl of 16 or 17, who looked with anxiety at the stranger.
Monsieur Morrel is in his room, is he not, Mademoiselle Julie? Said the cashier.
Yes, I think so, at least, said the young girl hesitatingly. Go and see, Cocles, and if my father is there, announce this gentleman.
It will be useless to announce me, mademoiselle, returned the Englishman. Monsieur Morrel does not know my name. This worthy gentleman has only to announce the confidential clerk of the house of Thomson and French of Rome, with whom your father does business. The young girl turned pale and continued to descend, while the stranger and Cocles continued to mount the staircase. She entered the office where Emmanuel was, while Cocles, by the aid of a key he possessed, opened a door in the corner of a landing place on the second staircase, conducted the stranger into an antechamber, opened a second door, which he closed behind him, and, having left the clerk of the house of Thomson and French alone, returned and signed to him that he could enter. The Englishman entered, and found Morrel seated at a table, turning over the formidable columns of his ledger, which contained the list of his liabilities. At the sight of the stranger, Monsieur Morrel closed the ledger, arose, and offered a seat to the stranger, and, when he had seen him seated, resumed his own chair. 14 years had changed the worthy merchant, who, in his 36th year at the opening of this history, was now in his 50th. His hair had turned white. Time and sorrow had ploughed deep furrows on his brow, and his look, once so firm and penetrating, was now irresolute and wandering, as if he feared being forced to fix his attention on some particular thought or person. The Englishman looked at him with an air of curiosity, evidently mingled with interest.
Monsieur,
said Morrel, whose uneasiness was increased by this examination,
you wish to speak to me?
Yes, monsieur. You are aware from whom I come?
The house of Thomson and French. At least, so my cashier tells me.
He has told you rightly. The house of Thomson and French has 300,000 or 400,000 francs to pay this month in France, and knowing your strict punctuality, have collected all the bills bearing your signature, and charged me as they become due to present them, and to employ the money otherwise. Morrel sighed deeply and passed his hand over his forehead, which was covered with perspiration.
So then, sir, said Morrel, you hold bills of mine?
Yes, and for a considerable sum.
What is the amount?
asked Morrel, with a voice he strove to render firm. Here is, said the Englishman, taking a quantity of papers from his pocket, an assignment of 200,000 francs to our house by Monsieur de Beauville, the inspector of prisons, to whom they are due. You acknowledge, of course, that you owe this sum to him?
Yes, he placed the money in my hands at 4.5% nearly 5 years ago.
When are you to pay?
Half the 15th of this month, half the 15th of next.
Just so. And now here are 32,500 francs, payable shortly. They are all signed by you, and assigned to our house by the holders.
I recognize them,
said Morrel, whose face was suffused, as he thought that for the first time in his life he would be unable to honor his own signature.
Is that all?
No. I have for the end of the month these bills which have been assigned to us by the house of Pascal and the house of Wilde and Turner of Marseille, amounting to nearly 55,000 francs. In all, 287,500 francs. It is impossible to describe what Morrel suffered during this enumeration.
287,500 francs, repeated he.
Yes, sir, replied the Englishman. I will not, continued he, after a moment's silence, conceal from you that while your probity and exactitude up to this moment are universally acknowledged, yet the report is current in Marseille that you are not able to meet your liabilities. At this almost brutal speech, Morrel turned deathly pale.
Sir, said he, up to this time, and it is now more than 24 years since I received the direction of this house from my father, who had himself conducted it for 35 years, never has anything bearing the signature of Morrel and Son been dishonored.
I know that, replied the Englishman, but as a man of honor should answer another, tell me fairly, shall you pay these with the same punctuality? Morrel shuddered and looked at the man, who spoke with more assurance than he had hitherto shown.
To questions frankly put, said he, a straightforward answer should be given. Yes, I shall pay if, as I hope, my vessel arrives safely. For its arrival will again procure me the credit which the numerous accidents of which I have been the victim has deprived me. But if the Pharaon should be lost, and this last resource be gone—
The poor man's eyes filled with tears. Well, said the other, if this last resource fail you?
Well, returned Morrel, it is a cruel thing to be forced to say, but, already used to misfortune, I must habituate myself to shame. I fear I shall be forced to suspend payment.
Have you no friends who could assist you? Morrel smiled mournfully.
In business, sir, said he, one has no friends, only correspondents.
It is true, murmured the Englishman. Then you have but one hope.
But one.
The last?
The last.
So that if this fail—
I am ruined, completely ruined.
As I was on my way here, a vessel was coming into port.
I know it, sir. A young man who still adheres to my fallen fortunes passes a part of his time in a belvedere at the top of the house, in hopes of being the first to announce good news to me. He has informed me of the arrival of this ship.
And it is not yours?
No, she is a Bordeaux vessel, La Gironde. She comes from India also, but she is not mine.
Perhaps she has spoken to the Pharaon, and brings you some tidings of her?
Shall I tell you plainly one thing, sir? I dread almost as much to receive any tidings of my vessel as to remain in doubt. Uncertainty is still hope.
Then in a low voice, Morrel added,
This delay is not natural. The Pharaon left Calcutta the 5th of February. She ought to have been here a month ago.
What is that? Said the Englishman. What is the meaning of that noise?
Oh, oh, cried Morrel, turning pale. What is it?
A loud noise was heard on the stairs, of people moving hastily, and half-stifled sobs. Morrel rose and advanced to the door, but his strength failed him, and he sank into a chair. The two men remained opposite one another, Morrel trembling in every limb, the stranger gazing at him with an air of profound pity. The noise had ceased, but it seemed that Morrel expected something. Something had occasioned the noise, and something must follow. The stranger fancied he heard footsteps on the stairs, and that the footsteps, which were those of several persons, stopped at the door. A key was inserted in the lock of the first door, and the creaking of hinges was audible.
There are only two persons who have the key to that door, murmured Morrel. Cocles and Julie.
At this instant the second door opened, and the young girl, her eyes bathed with tears, appeared. Morrel rose tremblingly, supporting himself by the arm of the chair. He would have spoken, but his voice failed him.
"Oh, father," said she, clasping her hands, "forgive your child for being the bearer of evil tidings."
Morrel again changed color. Julie threw herself into his arms.
"Oh, father, father," murmured she, "courage!"
"The Pharaon has gone down, then,"
said Morrel in a hoarse voice. The young girl did not speak, but she made an affirmative sign with her head as she lay on her father's breast.
"And the crew?"
asked Morrel.
"Saved," said the girl, saved by the crew of the vessel that has just entered the harbor."
Morrel raised his 2 hands to heaven with an expression of resignation and sublime gratitude.
"Thanks, my God," said he. "At least thou strikest but me alone."
A tear moistened the eye of the phlegmatic Englishman.
Come in, said Morrel, "for I presume you are all at the door."
Scarcely had he uttered those words than Madame Morrel entered, weeping bitterly. Emmanuel followed her, and in the antechamber were visible the rough faces of 7 or 8 half-naked sailors. At the sight of these men, the Englishman started and advanced a step, then restrained himself, and retired into the furthest and most obscure corner of the apartment. Madame Morrel sat down by her husband, and took one of his hands in hers. Julie still lay with her head on his shoulder. Emmanuel stood in the center of the chamber, and seemed to form the link between Morrel's family and the sailors at the door.
"How did this happen?"
said Morrel. "Draw near, Penelon," said the young man, "and tell us all about it." An old seaman, bronzed by the tropical sun, advanced, twirling the remains of a tarpaulin between his hands. "Good day, Monsieur Morrel," said he, as if he had just quitted Marseille the previous evening, and had just returned from Aix or Toulon.
"Good day, Penelon,"
returned Morrel, who could not refrain from smiling through his tears.
"Where is the captain?"
"The captain, Monsieur Morrel, he has stayed behind sick at Palma, but please God it won't be much, and you will see him in a few days, all alive and hearty."
"Well, now tell your story, Penelon."
Penelon rolled his quid in his cheek, placed his hand before his mouth, turned his head, and sent a long jet of tobacco juice into the antechamber, advanced his foot, balanced himself, and began.
"You see, Monsieur Morrel," said he, "we were somewhere between Cape Blanc and Cape Boyador, sailing with a fair breeze, south-southwest after a week's calm, when Captain Gaimard comes up to me, I was at the helm, I should tell you, and says, 'Penelon, what do you think of those clouds coming up over there?' I was just then looking at them myself. What do I think, Captain? Why, I think that they are rising faster than they have any business to do, and that they would not be so black if they didn't mean mischief." "That's my opinion too," says the captain, "and I'll take precautions accordingly. We are carrying too much canvas. Avast there, all hands, take in the studdingsails and lower the flying jib." It was time, the squall was on us, and the vessel began to heel. "Ah," says the captain, "we still have too much canvas set. All hands lower the mainsail." 5 minutes after, it was down, and we sailed under mizzen topsails and topgallant sails. "Well, Penelon," says the captain, "what makes you shake your head?" "Why," I says, "I still think you've got too much on." "I think you're right," answered he. "We shall have a gale." "A gale? More than that, we shall have a tempest, or I don't know what's what. You could see the wind coming like the dust in Montredon. Lucky the captain understood his business." "Take in 2 reefs in the topsails," cried the captain. "Let go the bowlines. Haul the brace. Lower the topgallant sails. Haul out the reef tackles on the yards."
"That was not enough for those latitudes," said the Englishman. "I should have taken 4 reefs in the topsails, and furled the spanker." His firm, sonorous, and unexpected voice made everyone start. Penelon put his hand over his eyes, and then stared at the man who thus criticized the maneuvers of his captain. "We did better than that, sir," said the old sailor respectfully. "We put the helm up to run before the tempest. 10 minutes after, we struck our topsails and scudded under bare poles." "The vessel was very old to risk that," said the Englishman.
That was what did the business. After pitching heavily for 12 hours, we sprung a leak. "Penelon," says the captain, "I think we are sinking. Give me the helm and go down into the hold." I gave him the helm and descended. There were already 3 feet of water. "All hands to the pumps," I shouted, but it was too late, and it seemed the more we pumped, the more came in. "Ah," said I, after 4 hours' work, "since we are sinking, let us sink. We can die but once." "That's the example you set, Penelon," cries the captain. "Very well, wait a minute." He went into his cabin and came back with a brace of pistols. "I will blow out the brains of the first man who leaves the pump," said he.
"Well done," said the Englishman.
"There's nothing gives you so much courage as good reasons," continued the sailor. "And during that time the wind had abated and the sea had gone down, but the water kept rising. Not much, only 2 inches an hour, but still it rose. 2 inches an hour does not seem much, but in 12 hours that makes 2 feet, and 3 we had before, that makes 5. "Come," says the captain, "we have done all in our power, and Monsieur Morrel will have nothing to reproach us with. We have tried to save the ship, now let us save ourselves. To the boats, my lads, as quick as you can." "Now," continued Penelon, "you see, Monsieur Morrel, a sailor is attached to his ship, but still more to his life, so we did not wait to be told twice, the more so as the ship was sinking under us, and seemed to say, 'Get along, save yourselves.' We soon launched the boat, and all 8 of us got into it. The captain descended last, or rather, he did not descend. He would not quit the vessel. So I took him round the waist and threw him into the boat, and then I jumped after him. It was time, for just as I jumped, the deck burst with a noise like the broadside of a man of war. 10 minutes after, she pitched forward, then the other way, spun round, and then goodbye to the Pharaon. As for us, we were 3 days without anything to eat or drink, so that we began to think of drawing lots who should feed the rest. When we saw La Gironde, we made signs of distress. She perceived us, made for us, and took us all on board. There now, Monsieur Morrel, that's the whole truth, on the honor of a sailor. Is it not true, you fellows there?"
A general murmur of approbation showed that the narrator had faithfully detailed their misfortunes and sufferings.
"Well, well," said Monsieur Morrel, "I know that there was no one in fault but destiny. It was the will of God that this should happen. Blessed be his name. What wages are due to you?"
"Oh, don't let us talk of that, Monsieur Morrel."
"Yes, but we will talk of it."
"Well then, 3 months," said Penelon.
"Cocles, pay 200 francs to each of these good fellows," said Morrel. "At another time," added he, "I should have said, give them besides 200 francs over as a present, but times are changed, and the little money that remains to me is not my own."
Penelon turned to his companions and exchanged a few words with them.
"As for that, Monsieur Morrel," said he, turning again his quid, "as for that—"
"As for what?"
"The money."
Well,
we all say that 50 francs will be enough for us at present, and that we will wait for the rest."
"Thanks, my friends, thanks," cried Morrel gratefully. Take it, and if you can find another employer, enter his service. You are free to do so."
These last words produced a prodigious effect on the seaman. Penelon nearly swallowed his quid. Fortunately, he recovered.
"What, Monsieur Morrel?" said he in a low voice. "You send us away. You are then angry with us."
No, said Monsieur Morrel. "I am not angry, quite the contrary, and I do not send you away. But I have no more ships, and therefore I do not want any sailors."
"No more ships?" returned Penelon. "Well, then you'll build some. We'll wait for you."
"I have no money to build ships with, Penelon," said the poor owner mournfully, "so I cannot accept your kind offer."
"No more money? Then you must not pay us. We can scud like the Pharaon under bare poles."
Enough, cried Morrel, almost overpowered. "Leave me, I pray you. We shall meet again in a happier time. Emmanuel, go with them and see that my orders are executed."
"At least we shall see each other again, Monsieur Morrel?" asked Penelon.
"Yes, I hope so at least. Now go."
He made a sign to Cocles, who went first. The seaman followed him, and Emmanuel brought up the rear.
"Now," said the owner to his wife and daughter, "leave me. I wish to speak with this gentleman."
And he glanced toward the clerk of Thomson and French, who had remained motionless in the corner during this scene, in which he had taken no part except the few words we have mentioned. The 2 women looked at this person, whose presence they had entirely forgotten, and retired. But, as she left the apartment, Julie gave the stranger a supplicating glance, to which he replied by a smile that an indifferent spectator would have been surprised to see on his stern features. The 2 men were left alone.
"Well, sir," said Morrel, sinking into a chair, "you have heard all, and I have nothing further to tell you."
"I see," returned the Englishman, "that a fresh and unmerited misfortune has overwhelmed you, and this only increases my desire to serve you."
"Oh, sir!" cried Morrel.
"Let me see," continued the stranger. "I am one of your largest creditors."
"Your bills, at least, are the first that will fall due."
"Do you wish for time to pay?"
"A delay would save my honor, and consequently my life."
"How long a delay do you wish for?" Morrel reflected.
2 months,
said he. "I will give you 3, replied the stranger.
"But," asked Morrel, "will the house of Thomson and French consent?"
"Oh, I take everything on myself. Today is the 5th of June."
"Yes."
"Well, renew these bills up to the 5th of September, and on the 5th of September, at 11 o'clock, the hand of the clock pointed to 11, I shall come to receive the money."
"I shall expect you," returned Morrel, "and I will pay you, or I shall be dead."
These last words were uttered in so low a tone that the stranger could not hear them. The bills were renewed, the old ones destroyed, and the poor shipowner found himself with 3 months before him to collect his resources.
The Englishman received his thanks with the phlegm particular to his nation, and Morrel, overwhelming him with grateful blessings, conducted him to the staircase. The stranger met Julie on the stairs. She pretended to be descending, but in reality she was waiting for him. "Oh, sir!" said she, clasping her hands. "Mademoiselle," said the stranger, "one day you will receive a letter signed Sinbad the Sailor. Do exactly what that letter bids you, however strange it may appear." "Yes, sir," returned Julie. "Do you promise?" "I swear to you I will." "It is well. Adieu, mademoiselle. Continue to be the good, sweet girl you are at present, and I have great hopes that heaven will reward you by giving you Emmanuel for a husband." Julie uttered a faint cry, blushed like a rose, and leaned against the baluster. The stranger waved his hand and continued to descend. In the court he found Penelon, who, with a rouleau of 100 francs in either hand, seemed unable to make up his mind to retain them. "Come with me, my friend," said the Englishman. "I wish to speak to you." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Count of Monte Cristo. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 30. The 5th of September. The extension provided for by the agent of Thomson and French, at the moment when Morrel expected it least, was to the poor shipowner so decided a stroke of good fortune that he almost dared to believe that fate was at length grown weary of wasting her spite upon him. The same day he told his wife, Emmanuel, and his daughter all that had occurred, and a ray of hope, if not of tranquillity, returned to the family. Unfortunately, however, Morrel had not only engagements with the house of Thomson and French, who had shown themselves so considerate towards him, and, as he had said, in business he had correspondents, and not friends. When he thought the matter over, he could by no means account for this generous conduct on the part of Thomson and French towards him, and could only attribute it to some such selfish argument as this: "We had better help a man who owes us nearly 300,000 francs, and have those 300,000 francs at the end of 3 months, than hasten his ruin and get only 6 or 8% of our money back again." Unfortunately, whether through envy or stupidity, all Morrel's correspondents did not take this view, and some even came to a contrary decision. The bills signed by Morrel were presented at his office with scrupulous exactitude, and thanks to the delay granted by the Englishman, were paid by Cocles with equal punctuality. Cocles thus remained in his accustomed tranquillity. It was Morrel alone who remembered with alarm that if he had to repay on the 15th the 50,000 francs of M. de Beauville, and on the 30th the 32,500 francs of bills, for which, as well as the debt due to the inspector of prisons, he had time granted, he must be a ruined man. The opinion of all the commercial men was that, under the reverses which had successively weighed down Morrel, it was impossible for him to remain solvent. Great, therefore, was the astonishment when, at the end of the month, he cancelled all his obligations with his usual punctuality. Still confidence was not restored to all minds, and the general opinion was that the complete ruin of the unfortunate shipowner had only been postponed until the end of the month. The month passed, and Morrel made extraordinary efforts to get in all of his resources. Formerly his paper, at any date, was taken with confidence, and was even in request. Morrel now tried to negotiate bills at 90 days only, and none of the banks would give him credit. Fortunately, Morrel had some funds coming in on which he could rely, and, as they reached him, he found himself in a condition to meet his engagements when the end of July came. The agent of Thomson and French had not been seen again at Marseilles. The day after, or 2 days after his visit to Morrel, he had disappeared, and as in the city he had had no intercourse but with the mayor, the inspector of prisons, and M. Morrel, his departure left no trace except in the memories of these 3 persons. As to the sailors of the Pharaon, they must have found snug berths elsewhere, for they also had disappeared. Captain Gaimard, recovered from his illness, had returned from Palma. He delayed presenting himself at Morrel's, but the owner, hearing of his arrival, went to see him. The worthy shipowner knew, from Penelon's recital, of the captain's brave conduct during the storm, and tried to console him. He brought him also the amount of his wages, which Captain Gaimard had not dared to apply for. As he descended the staircase, Morrel met Penelon, who was going up. Penelon had, it would seem, made good use of his money, for he was newly clad. When he saw his employer, the worthy tar seemed much embarrassed, drew on one side into a corner of the landing place, passed his quid from cheek to cheek, stared stupidly with his great eyes, and only acknowledged the squeeze of the hand which Morrel, as usual, gave him, by a slight pressure in return. Morrel attributed Penelon's embarrassment to the elegance of his attire. It was evident the good fellow had not gone to such an expense on his own account. He was, no doubt, engaged on board some other vessel, and thus his bashfulness arose from the fact of his not having, if we may so express ourselves, worn mourning for the Pharaon longer. Perhaps he had come to tell Captain Gaimard of his good luck, and to offer him employment from his new master.
"Worthy fellows," said Morrel as he went away, "may your new master love you as I loved you, and be more fortunate than I have been."
August rolled in, unceasing efforts on the part of Morrel to renew his credit or revive the old. On the 20th of August, it was known at Marseilles that he had left town in the mail coach, and it was then said that the bills would go to protest at the end of the month, and that Morrel had gone away and left his chief clerk, Emmanuel, and his cashier, Cocles, to meet the creditors. But, contrary to all expectation, when the 31st of August came, the house opened as usual, and Cocles appeared behind the grating of the counter, examined all bills presented with the usual scrutiny, and, from first to last, paid all with the usual precision. There came in, moreover, 2 drafts which M. Morrel had fully anticipated, and which Cocles paid as punctually as the bills which the shipowner had accepted. All this was incomprehensible, and then, with the tenacity peculiar to prophets of bad news, the failure was put off until the end of September. On the 1st, Morrel returned. He was awaited by his family with extreme anxiety, for from this journey to Paris they hoped great things. Morrel had thought of Danglars, who was now immensely rich, and had lain under great obligations to Morrel in former days, since it was to him owing that Danglars entered the service of the Spanish banker, with whom he had laid the foundations of his vast wealth. It was said at this moment that Danglars was worth from 6 to 8 millions of francs, and had unlimited credit. Danglars, then, without taking a crown from his pocket, could save Morrel. He had but to pass his word for a loan, and Morrel was saved. Morrel had long thought of Danglars, but had kept away from some instinctive motive, and had delayed as long as possible availing himself of this last resource. And Morrel was right, for he returned home crushed by the humiliation of a refusal. Yet on his arrival Morrel did not utter a complaint, or say one harsh word. He embraced his weeping wife and daughter, pressed Emmanuel's hand with friendly warmth, and then, going to his private room on the 2nd floor, had sent for Cocles. "Then," said the 2 women to Emmanuel, "we are indeed ruined." It was agreed in a brief council held among them that Julie should write to her brother, who was in garrison at Nîmes, to come to them as speedily as possible. The poor women felt instinctively that they required all their strength to support the blow that impended. Besides, Maximilian Morrel, though hardly 22, had great influence over his father. He was a strong-minded, upright young man. At the time when he decided on his profession, his father had no desire to choose for him, but had consulted young Maximilian's taste. He had at once declared for a military life, and had in consequence studied hard, passed brilliantly through the Polytechnic School, and left it as sub-lieutenant of the 53rd of the line. For a year he had held this rank, and expected promotion on the first vacancy. In his regiment, Maximilian Morrel was noted for his rigid observance, not only of the obligations imposed on a soldier, but also of the duties of a man, and he thus gained the name of the Stoic. We need hardly say that many of those who gave him this epithet repeated it because they had heard it, and did not even know what it meant. This was the young man whom his mother and sister called to their aid, to sustain them under the serious trial which they felt they would soon have to endure. They had not mistaken the gravity of the event, for the evening after Morrel had entered his private office with Cocles, Julie saw the latter leave it pale, trembling, and his features betraying the utmost consternation. She would have questioned him as he passed her by, but the worthy creature hastened down the stairs with unusual precipitation, and only raised his hands to heaven and exclaimed, "Oh, mademoiselle, mademoiselle, what a dreadful misfortune! Who could ever have believed it?" A moment afterward, Julie saw him go upstairs carrying 2 or 3 heavy ledgers, a portfolio, and a bag of money. Morrel examined the ledgers, opened the portfolio, and counted the money. All his funds amounted to 6,000 or 8,000 francs, his bills receivable up to the 5th to 4,000 or 5,000, which, making the best of everything, gave him 14,000 francs to meet debts amounting to 287,500 francs. He had not even the means for making a possible settlement on account. However, when Morrel went down to his dinner, he appeared very calm. This calmness was more alarming to the two women than the deepest dejection would have been. After dinner Morrel usually went out, and used to take his coffee at the Phocéen Club and read the Semaphore. This day he did not leave the house, but returned to his office. As to Cocles, he seemed completely bewildered. For part of the day he went into the courtyard, seated himself on a stone with his head bare and exposed to the blazing sun. Emmanuel tried to comfort the women, but his eloquence faltered. The young man was too well acquainted with the business of the house not to feel a great catastrophe hung over the Morrel family. Night came. The two women watched, hoping that when he left his room Morrel would come to them, but they heard him pass before their door, and trying to conceal the noise of his footsteps. They listened. He went into his sleeping room, and fastened the door inside. Madame Morrel sent her daughter to bed, and half an hour after Julie had retired, she rose, took off her shoes, and went stealthily along the passage, to see through the keyhole what her husband was doing. In the passage she saw a retreating shadow. It was Julie, who, uneasy herself, had anticipated her mother. The young lady went toward Madame Morrel. "He is writing," she said. They understood each other without speaking. Madame Morrel looked again through the keyhole. Morrel was writing, but Madame Morrel remarked what her daughter had not observed, that her husband was writing on stamped paper. The terrible idea that he was writing his will flashed across her. She shuddered, and yet had no strength to utter a word. Next day M. Morrel seemed as calm as ever, went to his office as usual, came to his breakfast punctually, and then, after dinner, he placed his daughter beside him, took her head in his arms, and held her for a long time against his bosom. In the evening, Julie told her mother that although he was apparently so calm, she had noticed that her father's heart beat violently. The next 2 days passed in much the same way. On the evening of the 4th of September, M. Morrel asked his daughter for the key of his study. Julie trembled at this request, which seemed to her of bad omen. Why did her father ask for this key which she had always kept, and which was only taken from her in childhood as a punishment? The young girl looked at Morrel. "What have I done wrong, father," she said, "that you should take this key from me?"
"Nothing, my dear," replied the unhappy man, the tears starting to his eyes at this simple question. "Nothing, only I want it."
Julie made a pretense to feel for the key. "I must have left it in my room," she said, and she went out, but instead of going to her apartment, she hastened to consult Emmanuel. "Do not give this key to your father," said he, "and tomorrow morning, if possible, do not quit him for a moment." She questioned Emmanuel, but he knew nothing, or would say nothing, what he knew. During the night between the 4th and 5th of September, Madame Morrel remained listening for every sound, and until 3 o'clock in the morning she heard her husband pacing the room in great agitation. It was 3 o'clock when he threw himself into bed. The mother and daughter passed the night together. They had expected Maximilian since the previous evening. At 8 o'clock in the morning Morrel entered their chamber. He was calm, but the agitation of the night was legible in his pale and careworn visage. They did not dare to ask him how he had slept. Morrel was kinder to his wife, more affectionate to his daughter, than he had ever been. He could not cease gazing at and kissing the sweet girl. Julie, mindful of Emmanuel's request, was following her father when he quitted the room, but he said to her quickly, "Remain with your mother, dearest." Julie wished to accompany him. "I wish you to do so," he said. This was the first time Morrel had ever spoken so, but he said it in a tone of paternal kindness, and Julie did not dare to disobey. She remained at the same spot, standing mute and motionless. An instant afterward the door opened, and she felt 2 arms encircle her and a mouth pressed to her forehead. She looked up and uttered an exclamation of joy. "Maximilian, my dearest brother!" she cried. At these words Madame Morrel rose and threw herself into her son's arms. "Mother," said the young man, looking alternately at Madame Morrel and her daughter, "what has occurred? What has happened? Your letter has frightened me, and I have come hither with all speed." "Julie," said Madame Morrel, making a sign to the young man, "go and tell your father that Maximilian has just arrived." The young lady rushed out of the apartment, but on the first step of the staircase she found a man holding a letter in his hand. "Are you not Mademoiselle Julie Morrel?" inquired the man with a strong Italian accent. "Yes, sir," replied Julie with hesitation. "What is your pleasure? I do not know you." "Read this letter," he said, handing it to her. Julie hesitated. "It concerns the best interests of your father," said the messenger. The young girl hastily took the letter from him. She opened it quickly and read, "Go this moment to the Allées des Melons,
Enter the house number 15. Ask the porter for the key of the room on the 5th floor. Enter the apartment. Take from the corner of the mantelpiece a purse netted in red silk, and give it to your father. It is important that he should receive it before 11 o'clock. You promise to obey me implicitly. Remember your oath. Sinbad the Sailor. The young girl uttered a joyful cry, raised her eyes, looked round to question the messenger, but he had disappeared. She cast her eyes again over the note, to peruse it a second time, and saw there was a postscript. She read, "It is important that you should fulfill this mission in person and alone. If you are accompanied by any other person, or should anyone else go in your place, the porter will reply that he does not know anything about it." This postscript decreased greatly the young girl's happiness. Was there nothing to fear? Was there not some snare laid for her? Her innocence had kept her in ignorance of the dangers that might assail a young girl of her age. But there is no need to know danger in order to fear it. Indeed, it may be observed that it is usually unknown perils that inspire the greatest terror. Julie hesitated, and resolved to take counsel. Yet, through a singular impulse, it was neither to her mother nor her brother that she applied, but to Emmanuel. She hastened down and told him what had occurred on the day when the agent of Thomson and French had come to her father's, related the scene on the staircase, repeated the promise she had made, and showed him the letter. "You must go, then, mademoiselle," said Emmanuel. "Go there?" murmured Julie. "Yes, I will accompany you." "But did you not read that I must be alone?" said Julie. "And you shall be alone," replied the young man. "I will await you at the corner of the Rue du Musée, and if you are so long absent as to make me uneasy, I will hasten to rejoin you, and woe to him of whom you should have cause to complain to me."
"Then, Emmanuel," said the young girl with hesitation, "it is your opinion that I should obey this invitation?"
"Yes. Did not the messenger say your father's safety depended upon it?"
"But what danger threatens him, then, Emmanuel?"
she asked. Emmanuel hesitated a moment, but his desire to make Julie decide immediately made him reply. "Listen," he said. "Today is the 5th of September, is it not?"
"Yes."
"Today, then, at 11 o'clock, your father has nearly 300,000 francs to pay."
"Yes, we know that."
"Well, then," continued Emmanuel, "we have not 15,000 francs in the house."
"What will happen, then?"
"Why, if today before 11 o'clock your father has not found someone who will come to his aid, he will be compelled at 12 o'clock to declare himself a bankrupt."
"Oh, come then, come!"
cried she, hastening away with the young man. During this time, Madame Morrel had told her son everything. The young man knew quite well that, after the succession of misfortunes which had befallen his father, great changes had taken place in the style of living and housekeeping. But he did not know that matters had reached such a point. He was thunderstruck. Then, rushing hastily out of the apartment, he ran upstairs, expecting to find his father in his study, but he rapped there in vain. While he was yet at the door of the study, he heard the bedroom door open, turned, and saw his father. Instead of going directly to his study, Monsieur Morrel had returned to his bedchamber, which he only this moment was quitting. Morrel uttered a cry of surprise at the sight of his son, of whose arrival he was ignorant. He remained motionless on the spot, pressing with his left hand something he had concealed under his coat. Maximilian sprang down the staircase, and threw his arms around his father's neck, but suddenly he recoiled, and placed his right hand on Morrel's breast. "Father!" he exclaimed, turning pale as death, "what are you going to do with that brace of pistols under your coat?"
"Oh, this is what I feared,"
said Morrel. "Father, father, in heaven's name!" exclaimed the young man, "what are these weapons for?"
"Maximilian,"
replied Morrel, looking fixedly at his son,
"you are a man, and a man of honor. Come, and I will explain to you."
And with a firm step, Morrel went up to his study, while Maximilian followed him, trembling as he went. Morrel opened the door, and closed it behind his son, then, crossing the anteroom, went to his desk, on which he placed the pistols, and pointed with his finger to an open ledger. In this ledger was made out an exact balance sheet of his affairs. Morrel had to pay, within half an hour, 287,500 francs. All he possessed was 15,257 francs.
"Read,"
said Morrel. The young man was overwhelmed as he read. Morrel said not a word. What could he say? What need he add to such a desperate proof in figures? "And have you done all that is possible, father, to meet this disastrous result?" asked the young man, after a moment's pause.
"I have,"
replied Morrel. "You have no money coming in on which you can rely?"
"None."
You have exhausted every resource?
All.
And in half an hour, said Maximilian in a gloomy voice, our name is dishonored.
Blood washes out dishonor,
said Morrel. You are right, father. I understand you. Then, extending his hand towards one of the pistols, he said, There is one for you and one for me. Thanks. Morrel caught his hand.
Your mother, your sister, who will support them?
A shudder ran through the young man's frame. Father, he said, do you reflect that you are bidding me to live?
Yes, I bid you do so,
said Morrel.
It is your duty. You have a calm, strong mind, Maximilian. Maximilian, you are no ordinary man. I make no requests or commands. I only ask you to examine my position as if it were your own, and then judge for yourself.
The young man reflected for a moment. Then an expression of sublime resignation appeared in his eyes, and with a slow and sad gesture he took off his 2 epaulettes, the insignia of his rank. Be it so then, my father, he said, extending his hand to Morrel. Die in peace, my father. I will live. Morrel was about to cast himself on his knees before his son, but Maximilian caught him in his arms, and those 2 noble hearts were pressed against each other for a moment.
You know it is not my fault,
said Morrel. Maximilian smiled. I know, father, that you are the most honorable man I have ever known.
Good, my son. And now there is no more to be said. Go and rejoin your mother and sister.
My father, said the young man, bending his knee,
bless me.
Morrel took the head of his son between his 2 hands, drew him forward, and kissing his forehead several times, said,
Oh, yes, yes, I bless you in my own name, and in the name of 3 generations of irreproachable men, who say through me, the edifice which misfortune has destroyed, Providence may build up again. On seeing me die such a death, the most inexorable will have pity on you. To you, perhaps, they will accord the time they refuse to me. Then do your best to keep our name free from dishonor. Go to work, labor, young man, struggle ardently and courageously. Live yourself, your mother and sister, with the most rigid economy, so that from day to day the property of those whom I leave in your hands may augment and fructify. Reflect how glorious a day it will be, how grand, how solemn, that day of complete restoration, on which you will say in this very office, My father died because he could not do what I have this day done, but he died calmly and peacefully, because in dying he knew what I should do.
My father, cried the young man, why should you not live?
If I live, all would be changed. If I live, interest would be converted into doubt, pity into hostility. If I live, I am only a man who has broken his word, failed in his engagements, in fact, only a bankrupt. If, on the contrary, I die, remember, Maximilian, my corpse is that of an honest but unfortunate man. Living, my best friends would avoid my house. Dead, all Marseille will follow me in tears to my last home. Living, you would feel shame at my name. Dead, you may raise your head and say, I am the son of him you killed because, for the first time, he has been compelled to break his word.
The young man uttered a groan, but appeared resigned.
And now, said Morrel, leave me alone, and endeavor to keep your mother and sister away.
Will you not see my sister once more? Asked Maximilian. A last but final hope was concealed by the young man in the effort of this interview, and therefore he had suggested it. Morrel shook his head.
I saw her this morning and bade her adieu.
Have you no particular commands to leave with me, father? Inquired Maximilian in a faltering voice.
Yes, my son, and a sacred command.
Say it, my father.
The house of Thomson and French is the only one who, from humanity, or it may be selfishness, it is not for me to read men's hearts, has had any pity for me. Its agent, who will in 10 minutes present himself to receive the amount of a bill of 287,500 francs, I will not say granted, but offered me 3 months. Let this house be the first repaid, my son, and respect this man.
Father, I will, said Maximilian.
And now, once more, adieu,
said Morrel.
Go, leave me. I would be alone. You will find my will in the secretary in my bedroom.
The young man remained standing and motionless, having but the force of will and not the power of execution.
Hear me, Maximilian, said his father. Suppose I was a soldier like you, and ordered to carry a certain redoubt, and you knew I must be killed in the assault. Would you say to me, as you have said now, 'Go, father, for you are dishonored by delay, and death is preferable to shame'?" "Yes, yes," said the young man, "yes." And once again embracing his father with convulsive pressure, he said, "Be it so, my father." And he rushed out of the study. When his son had left him, Morrel remained an instant standing with his eyes fixed on the door. Then, putting forth his arm, he pulled the bell. After a moment's interval, Cocles appeared. It was no longer the same man. The fearful revelations of the last 3 days had crushed him. This thought, the house of Morrel is about to stop payment, bent him to the earth more than 20 years could otherwise have done.
"My worthy Cocles," said Morrel in a tone impossible to describe, "do you remain in the antechamber? When the gentleman who came 3 months ago, the agent of Thomson and French, arrives, announce his arrival to me."
Cocles made no reply. He made a sign with his head, went into the anteroom, and seated himself. Morrel fell back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the clock. There were 7 minutes left. That was all. The hand moved on with incredible rapidity. He seemed to see its motion. What passed in the mind of this man at the supreme moment of his agony cannot be told in words. He was still comparatively young. He was surrounded by the loving care of a devoted family, but he had convinced himself, by a course of reasoning, illogical perhaps, yet certainly plausible, that he must separate himself from all he held dear in the world, even life itself. To form the slightest idea of his feelings, one must have seen his face with its expression of enforced resignation and its tear-moistened eyes raised to heaven. The minute hand moved on. The pistols were loaded. He stretched forth his hand, took one up, and murmured his daughter's name. Then he laid it down, seized his pen, and wrote a few words. It seemed to him as if he had not taken a sufficient farewell of his beloved daughter. Then he turned again to the clock, counting time now not by minutes, but by seconds. He took up the deadly weapon, his lips parted and his eyes fixed on the clock, and then shuddered at the click of the trigger as he cocked the pistol. At this moment of mortal anguish, the cold sweat came forth upon his brow, a pang stronger than death clutched at his heartstrings. He heard the door of the staircase creak on its hinges. The clock gave its warning to strike 11. The door of his study opened. Morrel did not turn round. He expected these words of Cocles:
"The agent of Thomson and French."
He placed the muzzle of the pistol between his teeth. Suddenly he heard a cry. It was his daughter's voice. He turned and saw Julie. The pistol fell from his hands. "My father!" cried the young girl, out of breath and half dead with joy. "Saved! You are saved!" And she threw herself into his arms, holding in her extended hand a red netted silk purse.
"Saved, my child!" said Morrel. "What do you mean?"
"Yes, saved! Saved! See, see!" said the young girl. Morrel took the purse and started as he did so, for a vague remembrance reminded him that it had once belonged to himself. At one end was the receipted bill for the 287,000 francs, and at the other was a diamond as large as a hazelnut, with these words on a small slip of parchment: "Julie's dowry." Morrel passed his hand over his brow. It seemed to him a dream. At this moment the clock struck 11. He felt as if each stroke of the hammer fell upon his heart.
"Explain, my child," he said. "Explain. Where did you find this purse?"
"In the house in the Allée des Melons, number 15, on the corner of a mantelpiece, in a small room on the 5th floor."
"But," cried Morrel, "this purse is not yours."
Julie handed her father the letter she had received that morning.
"And did you go alone?"
asked Morrel after he had read it. "Emmanuel accompanied me, father. He was to have waited for me at the corner of the Rue des Musées, but, strange to say, he was not there when I returned."
"Monsieur Morrel!" exclaimed a voice on the stairs. "Monsieur Morrel!"
"It is his voice," said Julie. At this moment Emmanuel entered, his countenance full of animation and joy. "The Pharaon!" he cried. "The Pharaon!"
What? The Pharaon? Are you mad, Emmanuel? You know the vessel is lost."
"The Pharaon, sir! They signal the Pharaon! The Pharaon is entering the harbor!" Morrel fell back in his chair. His strength was failing him. His understanding, weakened by such events, refused to comprehend such incredible, unheard of, fabulous facts. But his son came in. "Father," cried Maximilian, "how could you say the Pharaon was lost? The lookout has signaled her, and they say she is now coming into port."
"My dear friends," said Morrel, "if this be so, it must be a miracle of heaven. Impossible! Impossible!"
But what was real, and not less incredible, was the purse he held in his hand, the acceptance receipted, the splendid diamond.
"Ah, sir!" exclaimed Cocles, "what can it mean? The Pharaon!" "Come, dear ones," said Morrel, rising from his seat, "let us go and see, and heaven have pity upon us if it be false intelligence."
They all went out, and on the stairs met Madame Morrel, who had been afraid to go up into the study. In a moment they were at the Canebière. There was a crowd on the pier. All the crowd gave way before Morrel. "The Pharaon! The Pharaon!" said every voice. And, wonderful to see, in front of the tower of Saint Jean was a ship, bearing on her stern these words, printed in white letters: "The Pharaon, Morrel and Son, of Marseille." She was the exact duplicate of the other Pharaon, and loaded, as that had been, with cochineal and indigo. She cast anchor, clewed up sail, and on the deck was Captain Gaumard giving orders, and good old Penelon making signals to Monsieur Morrel. To doubt any longer was impossible. There was the evidence of the senses, and 10,000 persons had come to corroborate the testimony. As Morrel and his son embraced on the pierhead, in the presence and amid the applause of the whole city witnessing this event, a man, with his face half covered by a black beard, and who, concealed behind the sentry box, watched the scene with delight, uttered these words in a low tone: "Be happy, noble heart. Be blessed for all the good thou hast done and wilt do hereafter. And let my gratitude remain in obscurity, like your good deeds." And with a smile expressive of supreme content, he left his hiding place, and without being observed, descended one of the flights of steps provided for debarkation, and hailing 3 times, shouted, "Jacopo! Jacopo! Jacopo!" Then a launch came to shore, took him on board, and conveyed him to a yacht splendidly fitted up, on whose deck he sprung with the activity of a sailor. Thence he once looked again towards Morrel, who, weeping with joy, was shaking hands most cordially with all the crowd around him, and thanking with a look the unknown benefactor, whom he seemed to be seeking in the skies. "And now," said the unknown, "farewell kindness, humanity, and gratitude. Farewell to all the feelings that expand the heart. I have been heaven's substitute to recompense the good. Now let the God of vengeance yield to me his power to punish the wicked." At these words he gave a signal, and, as if only awaiting this signal, the yacht instantly put out to sea. End of chapter 30.